February 28, 2026. A date that will forever be etched into the annals of geopolitical history. The moment the unthinkable became reality. For decades, the balance of power in the Middle East rested on a razor's edge. But in a single surgical moment, that balance was shattered. In the early morning hours, as Tehran slept, an operation of unprecedented scale was already in its final terminal phase. The target was the most protected figure in the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. His location had been tracked for months. A network of stealth satellites provided real-time telemetry, bypassing the regime's most advanced electronic defenses. Nothing was left to chance. From undisclosed locations, stealth assets were deployed, silent, invisible, and carrying the weight of a historic decision. The munitions used were the latest in precision strike technology, designed to minimize collateral damage while ensuring total mission success. At exactly 0400 hours, the strike was initiated. Within seconds, the 3-decade reign of the supreme leader was over. In the immediate aftermath, chaos gripped the inner circles of the IRGC. The impossible had happened, and the chain of command was in shock. Signals intelligence soon confirmed the kill. The architect of Iran's regional strategy was gone, leaving a power vacuum of epic proportions. In Washington, the Situation Room was a hive of activity. The president had been briefed, and global diplomacy was now in overdrive. In Tel Aviv, the mood was one of grim satisfaction and heightened alert. The strike was a gamble, and the consequences were only beginning. Markets reacted instantly. Oil prices surged as the world braced for the response from the axis of resistance. Economic stability was at risk. The UN Security Council called for an emergency session. The world demanded answers, but the powers responsible remained in the shadows. Online, the news traveled faster than the smoke. Rumors and propaganda flooded the digital space as the regime struggled to control the narrative. Across Iran, IRGC bases were placed on the highest state of alert. Missile silos were prepped, and regional proxies awaited the order to strike back. Khamenei's legacy was one of defiance and expansion. For 35 years, he was the face of the Islamic Republic. Now, that face was a memory. The void he left behind was existential. The very soul of the revolution was now at a crossroads, with no clear path forward. In the halls of Qom, the whispers began immediately. Who would succeed the man who had been the ultimate authority? The battle for the future had begun. Regional allies braced for instructions. Regional rivals saw an opportunity. The map of the Middle East was being redrawn in real time. The assassination of Khamenei was a period at the end of a long, turbulent chapter. But the next chapter promised to be even more volatile. The strike was perfect, but the assassination was only the beginning. In our next part, we find the architects. Who gave the order? Part 2. The Architect. The smoke over Tehran had barely cleared when the world began to ask the inevitable question: who pulled the trigger? And more importantly, why? To find the answer, we must look beyond the explosion, into the invisible web of intelligence that spans from Maryland to Tel Aviv. This was not a solo mission. It was a joint architecture, a masterclass in cross-border coordination between the NSA and Israel's Unit 8200. For months, raw intelligence data, from encrypted signals to satellite telemetry, had been sifted, analyzed, and verified with cold, mathematical precision. In the shadows of the highest levels of government, the calculus was shifting. The risk of inaction was beginning to outweigh the risk of the strike. The architect was not a single person, but a committee of experts, generals, and politicians who saw a unique window of opportunity. From Fort Meade to the outskirts of Tel Aviv, the secure lines were buzzing. The target of opportunity had been identified. The clock was ticking. Encryption was bypassed. The regime's inner circle communications were no longer private. The supreme leader's every move was now being tracked in real time. In Washington, the final briefing was delivered. The implications were clear. The strike would decapitate the regime's regional strategy. The order was ready. In Tel Aviv, the command was synchronized. The IDF's most elite units were integrated into the plan, providing the tactical edge needed for the surgical strike. The authorization was given, a signature that would change history, a decision made not in anger, but in cold, calculated pursuit of a new regional order. The stealth satellites were repositioned. The window was open. The intelligence was absolute. The target was exactly where the data said he would be. While the world saw the explosion, the real battle was fought in the silicon and code of the world's most advanced cyber warfare suites. Legal justifications were drafted under the direct threat doctrine. The strike was framed not as an act of war, but as a preemptive defensive measure. Publicly, the denials were swift. But in the private corridors of power, the architecture of the strike was already being studied as a new blueprint for precision warfare. The architects knew the blowback would be severe. They had calculated the response of every proxy, every ally, and every rival in the region. At the heart of the decision was Iran's accelerating nuclear program. The strike was designed to send a clear message. The threshold had been crossed. Even as the missiles were in flight, shadow diplomacy was underway. Back-channel communications were open to prevent a total regional conflagration. The architects had also gamed out the succession. They knew that the death of Khamenei would trigger a power struggle unlike any in the Republic's history. This was calculated chaos. The goal was not just to remove a leader, but to destabilize the very foundation of the regime's expansionist ideology. The operation was a success. The architects had done their job. But as history teaches, the design is one thing. The reality of the aftermath is quite another. With the supreme leader gone, the focus now shifts to the empty chair. Who will seize the mantle of power? Next, we examine the succession crisis. Part 3, the succession. The seat of ultimate authority was empty. For the first time in 35 years, the Islamic Republic was a state without a supreme leader. As mandated by the Constitution, an interim leadership council was formed. The president, the chief justice, and a senior cleric took the helm of a nation in shock. But the interim council was only a placeholder. The real battle for the future was being fought behind the closed doors of the holy city of Qom. The assembly of experts, 88 clerics tasked with choosing the next supreme leader, was summoned for an emergency closed-door session. The deliberations were intense. This wasn't just about religious scholarship. It was about political survival, administrative competence, and the very soul of the revolution. Beneath the surface of clerical unity, old rivalries were reignited. Conservative hardliners, pragmatists, and the security elite each gamed out their next move. One name loomed larger than any other: Mojtaba Khamenei. The son of the late leader was seen by many as the natural, if controversial, successor. But his ascension risked the accusation of a hereditary succession, a direct challenge to the Islamic Revolution's core rejection of dynastic rule. The IRGC, the regime's Praetorian Guard, watched the proceedings with intense scrutiny. They needed a leader who would preserve their vast political and economic empire. On the streets of Tehran, the silence was heavy. The public, weary of economic struggle and repression, waited to see if the transition would bring change or more of the same. Behind the scenes, the assembly of experts assessed the candidates. Scholarship, experience, and loyalty to the Velayat-e Faqih were the metrics of the day. The Constitution mandated a new leader as soon as possible, but the process was designed for deliberation, not speed. The Republic's stability depended on a consensus. Global capitals watched the vacancy with a mix of anxiety and hope. A new supreme leader could double down on defiance or seek a new path of engagement. Other names were whispered: Larijani, Iraqi, Khatami. Each represented a different facet of the Islamic Republic's complex power structure. Each had a different vision for the future. The chair remained empty as the deliberations dragged on. The longer it took, the more the uncertainty grew, both inside and outside the country. Protest movements and social discontent, long suppressed by the regime, began to simmer. The transition of power was a moment of extreme vulnerability. The security apparatus responded by tightening its grip. Every corner of the country was under surveillance. The regime could not afford even a hint of instability. Regional allies looked for a sign of continuity. They needed to know that the forward defense doctrine would survive the man who had championed it for decades. History was watching. The second transition in the history of the Islamic Republic would determine if the system could survive without its longest-serving architect. Finally, a move was made. A consensus was reached. The Assembly of Experts was ready to announce the name that would define Iran's next era. The white smoke had risen. The mantle of power was about to be passed. But the man chosen would surprise the world and redefine the regime's future. The successor was named. But the choice would trigger an immediate and unprecedented challenge to the regime's core identity. Next, we examine the rise of Mojtaba. Part 4. The Rise of Mojtaba. As the sun rose over a leaderless Tehran, the question of who was answered with a name that had long been whispered in the shadows: Mojtaba. Mojtaba Khamenei had spent decades avoiding the spotlight, operating instead as the ultimate gatekeeper to his father's court. Now, the gatekeeper was the king. His rise was not merely a clerical decision, it was a strategic alliance. The IRGC saw in Mojtaba a leader who would protect their interests and ensure the regime's survival. But this choice was a gamble. The 1979 revolution was born from the rejection of hereditary monarchy. To many, the son succeeding the father felt like a betrayal. In the seminaries of Qom, the dissent was palpable. Senior clerics questioned his religious credentials, fearing the supreme leadership was becoming a family business. Mojtaba's first task was to secure his legitimacy. He needed more than his father's name. He needed the absolute submission of the state's sprawling bureaucracy. The security apparatus was deployed to crush any hint of public protest. The new era was to begin not with a celebration, but with a demonstration of force. Tehran held its breath. The silence on the streets was a mirror of the uncertainty in the corridors of power. The honeymoon period for the new leader did not exist. Regional proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and militias in Iraq, quickly signaled their loyalty. To them, Mojtaba represented continuity in a time of chaos. His first official decree was a signal to the world. There would be no retreat. The forward defense doctrine would be maintained at any cost. In Washington and Tel Aviv, analysts dissected the move. Was Mojtaba a strongman in the making, or a placeholder for a military takeover? The chair was no longer empty, but the man sitting in it faced a crisis of identity that the Islamic Republic had never before experienced. The economy remained his greatest threat. Sanctions, corruption, and the cost of regional wars were a weight that even the supreme leader's blessing could not lift. To the youth of Iran, Mojtaba was a relic of the past. The disconnect between the leadership and the people had reached a terminal velocity. The turban he now wore carried the weight of history, the expectations of the faithful, and the fears of the revolutionary elite. The battle for legitimacy was just beginning. To survive, Mojtaba would have to rely on the one institution that had become the true power in Iran. The IRGC was no longer just the protector of the revolution, it was the revolution, and its grip on the state was about to become absolute. While the clerics debated in Qom, the generals were moving in Tehran. The transition was complete, but the power had shifted from the pulpit to the barracks. History would judge Mojtaba not by his lineage, but by his ability to hold together a system that was fracturing under its own weight. The consolidation of power had begun. Mojtaba Khamenei was now the face of the Islamic Republic, but the hands that held him up were made of iron. The succession was over. A new leader had risen. But in the shadows, the true power brokers were preparing for their own ascension. With Mojtaba on the throne, the IRGC's role becomes the central story of the new era. Next, we examine the shadow government. Part 5. IRGC Dominance. Mojtaba wore the turban, but the crown had already been claimed by a different force. The era of the clerics was fading. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, had spent 3 decades building a state within a state. Now they were the state. They controlled the ports, the telecommunications networks, and the vast oil infrastructure. Their economic empire was the lifeblood of the nation. The transition of power was less a religious succession and more a hostile corporate takeover. The supreme leader had become a chairman of the board, beholden to his military shareholders. Deep underground, in missile cities carved into the mountains, the IRGC's aerospace forces continued to expand their arsenal, unchecked by civilian oversight. The Quds Force, the elite external operations branch, doubled down on its asymmetric warfare strategy. They needed to project strength to cover their internal vulnerability. The state media apparatus was purged of moderates. The narrative was strictly controlled. The assassination was a declaration of war, and unity under the IRGC was the only defense. Domestically, the Basij militia and internal security forces were unleashed. The tolerance for dissent, already razor-thin, evaporated completely. A digital iron curtain descended. The IRGC's cyber units expanded their domestic surveillance, turning the Republic into a panopticon. The institutions of the Republic, the Parliament, the Presidency, remained intact, but they were hollowed out, mere facades for the military dictatorship operating behind them. As the West tightened sanctions in response to the IRGC's absolute power, the Iranian economy plunged further into crisis. The middle class was decimated. Yet, the IRGC thrived. Their vast smuggling networks and black market operations ensured that the elite remained insulated from the economic collapse. Beneath the surface of total control, a dangerous pressure was building. The social contract was broken, replaced entirely by fear. To deter future strikes, the IRGC commanders pushed the nuclear program to the brink of weaponization. They believed only a bomb could guarantee their survival. Mojtaba Khamenei sat in his father's office, issuing religious edicts. But every major decision was pre-approved by the generals. The supreme leader was now a captive of his protectors. The military-industrial complex accelerated the production of drones and ballistic missiles, flooding the region with cheap, lethal technology. The Republic was gone in all but name. Iran had transitioned into a hardline, security-first military dictatorship draped in the robes of Shia Islam. With internal opposition silenced and the clerics marginalized, the IRGC turned its full attention outward. The region was their chessboard. They signaled their proxies across the Middle East. The assassination of the supreme leader would not go unanswered. The retaliation phase was about to begin. As the IRGC consolidated its iron grip, the shockwaves of the strike finally reached the borders. Next, we examine the regional fallout. Part 6. Regional Blowback. The assassination of Khamenei was not a localized event. It was the spark that ignited the entire axis of resistance. Across the region, the proxies that the IRGC had spent decades arming and training received the order. The retaliation phase had begun. In Lebanon, Hezbollah mobilized. Despite suffering significant losses in previous conflicts, their arsenal of tens of thousands of short and medium-range missiles remained a formidable threat. Just days after the strike in Tehran, Hezbollah launched a coordinated barrage toward northern Israel, signaling that their last war had truly begun. Israel's air defense systems, from Iron Dome to David's Sling, were pushed to their limits. The sky above the Galilee became a theater of high-tech interception. When long-range missiles targeted Tel Aviv, the reality of the regional blowback settled in. The conflict was no longer contained to proxy borders. Israel responded with overwhelming force, launching hundreds of sorties across Lebanon. The Dahiya Doctrine was invoked, targeting infrastructure and financial networks with relentless precision. Further south, the Houthis in Yemen, long considered the most unpredictable arm of the Axis, declared their hands were on the trigger. They possessed the capability to cripple global shipping. Their hybrid arsenal of ballistic missiles and naval drones turned the Red Sea into a highly contested battleground. In response, the United States bolstered its naval presence. Operation Epic Fury required absolute control of the maritime domains to prevent a wider escalation. The 2026 National Defense Strategy had framed Israel as the model ally. This crisis was the ultimate test of that deep, integrated military partnership. But the escalation sent shockwaves through the Gulf states. Countries that had pursued de-escalation with Iran now found themselves caught in the crossfire. Iran's retaliatory strikes targeted not just military assets, but the critical infrastructure of U.S. allies in the region. The threat to global energy supplies was immediate. Simultaneously, a massive cyber war erupted. Iranian hackers launched devastating attacks against Israeli and American networks, attempting to paralyze command structures. The conflict highlighted a grim reality. Precision strikes could remove leadership, but they could not easily dismantle the decentralized, asymmetric threat of drone swarms. U.S. Central Command was fully mobilized. The objective was no longer just deterrence, but active defense against a multi-front assault by an enraged Axis. The decapitation of the Iranian regime had achieved its immediate tactical goal, but the strategic blowback threatened to drag the entire Middle East into a protracted war. As missiles flew and markets plummeted, the architects of the strike realized the true cost of their operation. The geopolitical landscape was permanently fractured. But while the region burned, the Iranian people faced their own crisis. Next, we examine the internal economic collapse. Part 7. Economic Fallout. While missiles lit up the regional skies, a silent, more insidious explosion was occurring within Iran's borders. The total collapse of its economic foundation. The national currency, the rial, entered a death spiral. Devalued beyond recognition, it traded at record lows, effectively erasing the life savings of millions overnight. Hyperinflation gripped the markets. The cost of basic essentials, bread, meat, cooking oil, surged by nearly 100%, pushing the nation toward a hunger crisis. Sanctions, now tightened to a stranglehold, severed the regime's oil lifeline. Exports plummeted, leaving the state budget in a state of terminal deficit. China became the dominant, and often only, buyer of Iranian crude, demanding substantial discounts that further bled the treasury dry. The autonomy of the state was the price of survival. The middle class, once the backbone of the republic, was decimated. Professionals found their salaries worth a fraction of their former value. Their dreams of a stable future evaporated. Yet the IRGC elite remained insulated. Their control over smuggling networks and the black market ensured that while the nation suffered, the protectors of the revolution thrived. A parallel economy emerged. In the shadows, the black market became the only place to secure foreign currency or high-end goods, further enriching those with the keys to the kingdom. By mid-2026, nearly half of the population was projected to live below the poverty line. For many, daily survival replaced political engagement as the primary concern. The national GDP was estimated to fall by more than 10%. The state's ability to maintain even basic infrastructure was now in question. The central bank was powerless. Every attempt to stabilize the rial was met with the cold reality of a treasury drained by war and systemic corruption. Wage growth lagged behind inflation by a staggering margin. The social contract, loyalty in exchange for basic security, was fundamentally and perhaps permanently broken. Protests, initially sparked by economic grievances, began to simmer across all provinces. The anger was no longer just about the price of bread, it was about the price of the system. The IRGC's response was predictable: further repression. Every province was treated as a potential battlefield in an internal war against the regime's own citizens. Fear became the primary tool of governance. But fear, while effective in the short term, could not fill the empty stomachs of 80 million people. Power outages became common. The once proud infrastructure of the Republic was crumbling under the weight of underinvestment and the cost of regional adventurism. Desperate for leverage, the leadership diverted the remaining treasury to the nuclear program. They believed that only the ultimate weapon could deter the internal and external threats to their rule. The economic fallout was not just a crisis of capital, it was a crisis of the revolutionary soul. The system was eating itself from the inside out. The architects of the strike had calculated for retaliation, but the total internal economic implosion of Iran was a variable that even they had perhaps underestimated. As the economy crumbled, the pressure reached a breaking point. Next, we examine the explosion of social discontent. Part 8. Internal Agitation. While the elite debated in calm and the IRGC tightened its grip, the streets of Iran began to speak. The long-suppressed anger of a nation had finally reached a flashpoint. It began in the Grand Bazaar. Shopkeepers, crippled by the collapsing rial and soaring costs, closed their doors. The economic heart of the city had stopped beating. The grievance was no longer localized. From the borderlands to the capital, the protests spread with lightning speed, transcending class, age, and geography. University students, factory workers, teachers, and pensioners, segments of society that had rarely united before, were now marching as one. The social contract was dead. The slogans shifted. Economic frustration transformed into a political demand for the end of the system itself. The shadow of the 1979 revolution loomed over the new dissenters. The death of Khamenei had removed the ultimate symbol of stability. In the power vacuum, the public saw not just a transition, but an opportunity for a different future. Calls for unified action grew louder. Exiled figures and domestic activists alike pushed for a referendum, demanding the right to decide the nation's political identity. The regime's response was swift and brutal. The security apparatus, fearing for its own survival, was given a simple instruction: crush the dissent at any cost. Repression escalated to unprecedented levels. The use of force was no longer a deterrent. It was an act of open warfare against the populace. The human cost began to mount. Thousands were killed or injured. The government acknowledged the violence, but the true scale of the tragedy was hidden behind a wall of silence and propaganda. Mass arrests followed. Tens of thousands were detained, including children as young as 14. The prisons were overflowing, and the rule of law had become a weapon. Enforced disappearances became a common tactic. The fear of being taken in the night was used to paralyze those who still considered taking to the streets. To conceal their actions, the government imposed total internet blackouts. The nation was cut off from the world, silenced in its most desperate hour. Extensive surveillance and facial recognition were used to identify every dissenter. There was no longer any private space in the Islamic Republic. Every citizen was a target. The death penalty was deployed as a political tool. The judiciary, once a symbol of justice, now functioned as the final stage of the regime's repressive machinery. But protests in Iran are not a new phenomenon. The country has a long history of recurring uprisings, each one larger and more determined than the last. The public's resilience was absolute. The regime's reliance on brutal force revealed a terminal crisis of legitimacy. A system that must war against its own people to survive is a system in its final stages. The interplay of internal crises and external military pressure led to a point of no return. The status quo was shattered, and the transition of power was now irreversible. The international community condemned the brutality. The UN demanded an immediate end to the force, but the regime was now deaf to everything but its own survival. As the internal agitation threatened the very existence of the state, the global response accelerated. Next, we examine the diplomatic shockwaves. Part 9. International Response. As the smoke cleared over Tehran, the fire of a global diplomatic crisis was just beginning to burn. The world turned its eyes toward New York. An emergency session of the UN Security Council was summoned. The charge? A violation of international law so profound it threatened the very foundation of state sovereignty. Washington stood firm. The administration framed the strike not as an act of war, but as a preemptive defensive necessity to halt an imminent nuclear threat. Beijing's condemnation was swift and absolute. Foreign Minister Wang Yi warned that regime change through assassination was a path to global instability. Moscow echoed the sentiment, portraying the strike as a cynical violation of international norms. Russia saw an opportunity to further its anti-Western alignment. In the halls of international law, the debate was existential. Does the right to self-defense extend to the extrajudicial killing of a sitting head of state? The ripple effects were immediate. Alliances were tested, trade agreements were scrutinized, and the machinery of global power was thrown into a state of high alert. The threat to the Strait of Hormuz loomed. With 20% of the world's oil passing through this choke point, the economic survival of the West was at stake. China, purchasing 80% of Iran's oil, prioritized price stability over political ideology. Beijing's primary goal was a transition that preserved state institutions. Russia, while offering political solidarity, saw an economic windfall in the soaring energy prices caused by the conflict, a complex mix of cooperation and competition. Behind the closed doors of the Security Council, the real negotiations were taking place. Consensus among the Permanent Five was a distant, perhaps impossible goal. Shadow diplomacy was the only thing preventing a total regional conflagration. Secret lines were opened between rivals to prevent a cycle of irreversible escalation. The assassination revealed the fragility of international norms. When the world's most powerful states choose to ignore the rules themselves begin to dissolve. The 2026 National Defense Strategy aimed to integrate Israel with its Arab neighbors. The crisis was a moment of forced alignment against a common threat. The international response was not just a reaction to an event. It was the realization that the world had entered a new, more dangerous phase of geopolitical rivalry. History was not just watching, it was issuing a warning. The system built in the aftermath of the last Great War was now under its greatest strain. The diplomatic phase was over, the tactical phase was complete. Now, only the question of the future remained. Next, our final part, the future of Iran. The strike of February 28, 2026 did more than remove a leader. It shattered a decades-old status quo, leaving a nation and a region at a definitive crossroads. As we look toward 2030, expert analysis reveals three primary trajectories for the Islamic Republic. Each path carries profound implications for the world. The first is managed continuity. By digging in and maintaining its core hardline policies, the regime attempts to ensure its durability through absolute submission and regional defiance. The second path is a hard right shift, the formalization of military dominance. In this scenario, the IRGC uses the Republic's institutions to establish a security-first dictatorship. The third, and perhaps most transformative path, is evolutionary reform, a regime update driven by internal social pressures and a desire for international engagement. At the heart of this pressure is a young, urbanized, and educated population. They seek a third way, one that is national, independent, and accountable. The economy will be the ultimate catalyst. Without fundamental reform and sanctions relief, the structural challenges facing the regime may become insurmountable. Iran's regional posture will also evolve. A more pragmatic leader might recalibrate the forward defense strategy to prioritize internal stability over external expansion. But the nuclear question remains the most dangerous variable. Will the new leadership see the bomb as their only insurance policy, or as a bargaining chip for a new future? The world will be watching closely. The international community's response, engagement, or containment will further shape the boundaries of Iran's possibilities. Iranian society is redefining its identity, navigating the tensions between religious tradition and social modernity, and between political control and individual aspiration. History is not just a record of the past, it is a guide to the future. The choices made in the next 5 years will determine the legacy of the revolution. The empty chair will eventually be filled, not just by a person, but by a new vision for what it means to be a modern nation-state in the 21st century. The calculated chaos of the assassination may have been the necessary shock to force a resolution. The status quo was no longer an option. The era of the second supreme leader is over. The era of his successor has begun, and with it, the story of Iran enters its most critical chapter yet. In the end, the future of Iran will be written not by missiles or intelligence briefings, but by the 80 million souls who call this ancient land home. This has been the assassination of Khamenei, how it happened and what comes next. A surgical strike, a global shock, a new era. Thank you for watching. Next, we explore the aftermath of global shifts in power. For now, the story of the strike remains a warning and a blueprint for the future. End of series.